$1,200. This number glows on your screen at 12 in the morning as you lie on the mattress you bought from the classifieds with a man who called himself Ivan. You check the figure again in 60 seconds, and again it does not change. It always fails to change at midnight. But the reason for this, the reason why this particular number comes to you at this time, is much more interesting than the number itself. You are 23 and deep in debt, your student loans exceeding any sum of money you have in the bank. And the reason why this is happening, why you do not feel the need to do anything about it, even as you lie staring at the glow of your cell phone, is because you have been living on the wrong side of the numbers. You are barely surviving, not surviving gloriously, not surviving in a way that could be considered living, but barely staying above water. And that is, for you at 23, the best possible outcome. It is the best possible outcome because you are living the salary of a young man in the 21st century, where 2,500 hryvnias is barely enough to buy bread and meat at the local store, and the way a 23-year-old young man who has no idea what to do with his life perceives wealth is as the other guy on the street whose house is much nicer, and the ability to split the subscription to Netflix with the person I used to live with, but whose name I no longer remember. At 0, the money does not represent any particular power either you have or you are slowly choking to death on. The first rule of thumb, which almost everyone who is not deeply knowledgeable about financial markets fails to grasp, is that at the bottom, all financial decisions are primarily emotional decisions, and that their consequences are magnified in the reverse direction. Something happens, and you feel richer, you buy a new car, it crashes. The Economist has a word for that phenomenon, which does not really signify anything in particular, lifestyle creep. But the ability to feel richer only manifests itself as the ability to breathe, and for young men of 23, the ability to breathe often means the ability to buy that other guy on the street, who owns a newer car and a better apartment, something that does not really belong to them, but which, nevertheless, feels necessary to possess. You take a big step forward when one day you manage to pay off your smallest, most inconsequential debt in full, and you do not tell anyone about it, because no one would understand what it signifies to you. But it does indeed signify something big. The first time in your life you managed to make a decision that moved you in the right direction. And even though your income was still barely enough to cover your expenses, that first victory was enough to make you realize that you had crossed a certain point, the one at which the financial decisions you make henceforth will start to represent something greater than just barely enough to cover them. And it is at 26 that you cross that nice round figure of 10,000, and you start checking that particular savings account on a daily basis for the first time in your life, not out of fear that something terrible might happen, but rather out of sheer disbelief that it actually did. And psychologists would tell you that what actually happened, and why this particular financial decision manifested itself in your life the way it did, is that the weight of the number in itself was insufficient, and you needed 10,000 to feel like someone who had earned it. You start reading books, good books, not self-help guides this time, and you learn what an index fund actually is. And you open a brokerage account, and you spend 3 weeks looking at it before depositing a single penny into it. And you celebrate the day you take profits out of it, when the market suddenly drops by half on the day you sell. And your hand hovers over the sell button in hesitation the entire day, but ultimately does not press it. It is that single moment, more than anything else in your life, which decides for you where you stand in your relationship with money. It decides whether the fear will rule your financial decisions from here onward, or whether you will be the master of them, the one who makes them master themselves. Because you realize that the money you earned was never supposed to be a security blanket, but rather information, valuable data, which you use to your benefit in order to build new, valuable things. And then you start actually doing that, building valuable things, because money starts representing not just the ability to buy something immediately available, but also the ability to purchase time and to buy assets that will build themselves. You have a pretty decent but not spectacular income. You have an emergency fund. You max out your retirement savings every year, you do everything right, and you still barely make ends meet. But then, one evening, when you have nothing better to do, you start doing the math. 40 years of steady savings at your current rate, entered honestly and transparently into Excel, and you look at the resulting number at the end of the spreadsheet and realize, with barely any fear or even disappointment, that it is barely enough to be worth it, that it is barely enough to serve its purpose, but it is not, ultimately, what you wanted. It is the competence plateau, the point at which you have achieved financial competence, but you are not yet able to build financial wealth the way you would like to. The second rule of thumb, the one that everyone who has already achieved a certain degree of financial success understands intuitively, but rarely talks about openly, is that a salary is a ceiling masquerading as a floor. And so you start building things on the side, and you do not really call them businesses, because they barely are in any meaningful sense of the word, but they do provide you with some extra income every now and then. And you start investing almost all of that extra income back into the business. And 14 months later, you realize that you still buy the same groceries and use the same credit card to buy food at the store, but that somehow, your net worth has crossed that invisible threshold that you have not really talked about with anyone. Your assets are now producing income for you that you did not really have to work for, and you start understanding the concept of an asset in general, not just theoretically but practically. And Warren Buffett could have described the same feelings as you at this point in his life, because he made most of his money sitting at his desk, reading newspapers and earning money because of time and leverage that he acquired in his youth. Your relationship with time has changed fundamentally, and you understand what most people at your level rarely realize, that every hour you spend doing something that does not compound is an hour spent wasting your life. You cross the six-figure net worth mark at 33. You buy a small apartment building at a reasonable price. You have a nice but not spectacular sum of money in your brokerage account. The extra project you have on the side is now paying you more per month than your main job, and you still do not talk to anyone about your money, because you have realized that people at your level rarely talk about money, and that asking them about it will often make them angry or deluded. But neither of those emotions is particularly helpful, so you stop asking altogether. You start saying no to people, to opportunities that would have terrified your younger self, to destination weddings you could not afford, to group vacations where you would have ended up paying for everyone else to come along, to projects pitched to you by friends, most of whom barely understand the principles of cash flow, and you realize, with barely any fear or even disappointment, that it feels good to say no, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. And then the third rule of thumb reveals itself to you in full detail, the one that rarely talks about money openly but always manifests itself in your financial decisions, in the way you build things versus the way you buy them. Until you reach a certain point, you will buy your assets, but after that point, your assets will buy you things. Your net worth now comfortably exceeds 6 figures. It has crossed the threshold of a 7-figure mark at 37 when you restructure your business, add a partner to it, and exit one of your early investments. You still do not sleep as well as you used to, but it is no longer because of worry or even stress, but rather the opposite. You lie awake at night calculating projections in your head, sending emails to people across different time zones, declining a 6-figure job offer for a more interesting but complicated opportunity, and your parents are disappointed in you, but you cannot explain to them why, so you simply tell them it was not the right fit, which it technically was not. But then something happens to you on an ordinary Tuesday, something that barely even has a name, and you realize that your account balance has crossed the 1 million threshold. You feel vaguely triumphant, but the feeling is quickly replaced by the hollow realization that it would have been much easier to simply have $1 million, that it, ultimately, barely represents enough to feel secure, and that the amount of time and effort you have devoted to it never paid off in absolute terms, because $1 million with a modest yield will provide you with a modest income, but that is about it. The $1 million marker was not a goal but a simple proof of concept, and the feelings it provokes in you are not those of happiness but rather something close to an existential crisis. Since you realize, at the most basic level, that you were not really aiming to feel happy at this point in your life, but rather to achieve some kind of critical mass that was never clearly defined. Your money, your net worth, turns into the low millions, and for the first time in your life it stops being an object of fear. It turns into a resource the way time turned into a resource for you at about the same age. And you start thinking not about how your money can make you feel better, but rather about where it is positioned, what risks it is exposed to, how much time does it have to live before retirement, and what you can do to mitigate some of those risks. You hire a wealth manager, and then stop paying him when you realize that you understand your finances better than he does, and then hire someone else who charges you more but does not waste your time. And you realize that the real reason you have crossed that particular threshold is because your business now generates enough income to fund your expenses, and your brokerage account has enough diversity to fund your retirement, and you take a 3-week vacation, and you do not check your emails for 5 days of that period. That is the thing that people at your level cannot buy, the 3-figure vacation days that most people at the lower levels will spend working for. And so the fourth rule of thumb reveals itself to you, that wealth ultimately does not represent something you acquired, but rather something you no longer have to do. The dynamics change fundamentally at the 5 million net worth mark, and you realize that at that point, building wealth becomes much less about building it, and much more about positioning it. You start dealing in much bigger numbers, and you spend much more time thinking about the way you move money around than the way you make it. And you do deals that have the potential to yield nothing and the potential to yield small fortunes at the same time. And you realize that ultimately, the point of engaging in them is not really the rewards they bring, but the positioning they create for you in other, bigger opportunities. You meet people worth tens and then hundreds of millions. You study their mental models rather than their worth, their timing rather than their positioning, and you realize that at your level and above, the ability to think in long-run probabilities is much more important than any skill you have at trying to influence individual outcomes. Daniel Kahneman has written extensively about the ways regular people fail at thinking about long-run probabilities, and most of those failures stem from an inability to intuitively grasp the power of time. And so you stop talking to people about their money, not because you are arrogant, but because the conversations rarely make sense to you anymore. Since your interlocutors begin attaching deeply emotional meaning to numbers that no longer represent anything to you at this point in your life, people at this level no longer measure themselves in wealth, in large percentages, or even in straight numbers, because the scale of those numbers rarely affects their decisions, and saying any of it out loud makes you sound arrogant, so you stop saying it. You sit in the kinds of rooms you used to imagine as a young man learning about finance, not because you are famous, but because people pay you for your opinion. A family office wants to co-invest with you in a particular asset class, and a private equity firm wants your opinion on an acquisition, and you realize with barely any additional effort that the things you have learned about finance have made you interesting to some truly powerful people. And so the fifth rule of thumb reveals itself to you at this point, and it is not really much of a rule at all, but rather a simple observation that at a certain level of net worth, your reputation begins to generate returns on its own, independent of any of the assets you hold or even any particular effort you invest in building or maintaining your reputation. The decisions you need to make begin to carry much more importance, with no obvious way to measure your impact on them. And an old company restructuring its division lays off some of its employees in the process. And some of those people used to work for you, and you do not do anything about it because you know, intuitively, that the numbers will take care of themselves, and they do, because the decision ultimately affects your own personal income, though not in any immediately tangible way. You feel neither good nor bad about it, but most importantly, you feel no particular need to change anything about it. And so your net worth crosses the threshold of 8 figures, and you realize that you will need to create structures around your wealth in order to protect it, and you start studying existing structures others have created around theirs, because the point of creating them in the first place is to remove yourself from the equation as much as possible. You have a personal trust that will protect your assets, a foundation that does not fund anything particularly charitable but exists to give you access to certain opportunities, and you pay regular taxes on it all because you understand the true value of what you are doing. At some point around this time, you realize that the game has changed yet again, and it is rarely about you anymore. It is about others and the way they interact with the same structures you have put in place. You have built things, and those things continue to operate successfully in your absence, because that was ultimately the point of building them. It is not loneliness, but the feeling of being disconnected from everything that makes you understand the space between your actions and their consequences. The way your influence rarely extends to the people you actually want to affect, and you rarely feel any particular need to fix it, because it would require a lot of effort, and at this level of your net worth, the only currency that still matters is time. You give money away, and you do it not out of generosity but out of necessity, because at the level of 8 figures, money represents very little to you in absolute terms, and the ability to give things away becomes much more rewarding than any potential power you thought you might have gained at this point in your life. And then the sixth and final rule of thumb reveals itself to you at this point, and it says that money ultimately stops measuring your worth at this point and begins to measure the scope of your influence instead. You reach 9 figures, and hardly anyone outside of a small group of people knows exactly what that means. And you have not worked for a single day in the last 9 years, but you still do not stop working because there is barely a single thing in your life that you think is worth stopping for. You think in cycles, not in quarters or years, but in long-run macroeconomic trends, and you operate as someone who has already positioned themselves advantageously in regards to those trends, which rarely change much about your day-to-day life. But they nonetheless allow you to do things others cannot. You sit in a boardroom with a handful of people whose combined net worth would be enough to fund the economy of an entire country, speaking for 4 minutes before asking 2 questions that cause the entire meeting to change its course. And you leave before lunchtime, and you think to yourself that this is what it means to have power at its most basic level. No one asks those questions unless they know that the answers matter, and no one changes their behavior unless they know that their behavior has changed something that matters. And somewhere out in the world, in a country you barely know, a 23-year-old young man is looking at the same number as you are right now, $1,200, on the screen of a banking application he has just opened on his cell phone. He stands in a grocery store, calculating in his head, replacing the good coffee with the store brand, and he thinks to himself that he is watching the story of his life unfold before his eyes. And he just does not know it yet. The system does not ask you questions. It does not care whether you are ready, whether you want it badly enough, whether the trade you are making is worth it or not. The system only asks you to appear, and then it takes all of the ones who do from you, regularly and methodically every single day. And those who remain are the ones who continue to appear, patiently and diligently, without questioning whether it is worth it or not, without flinching every time you take some of their money, and without leaving, and the ones who stay ultimately begin to accumulate, and everything that comes with them. The number 1200 is where almost everyone begins. It always does.